Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me again. We get to talk about some cool stuff. If you have not seen this little panel of experts, I don't know if that's what we are, but nevertheless, if you haven't seen this little panel of experts, these guys are in whatever order you see them on the screen. There's Scott Walker there. Scott is a veteran, and we give him all kinds of grief about the service he was in, but that's okay. I'm not going to do it today, Scott, I promise.
I
And then
retired from the right one.
that's
I'll
what
say
you
that.
say. Yeah, right. Where you had to be extra tall, but we won't talk about that. And then
Easy.
former police officer and currently, I think, a captain or some sort of upper muckety muck with the Arizona Rangers. He is an expert in international investigations and international security. He travels around digitally a lot and then sometimes in person. So he's got a lot of experience about a lot of this stuff, which is very good. And he's actually in the great state of Arizona, which is my second home state. He's in Phoenix. My second home is up near Show Low, but so we're a little bit north of there.
I'll be
And then
up there
there's
this
Dave
weekend.
Weiner, my friend and co-teacher on a lot of things. Former Air Force. He's an Air Force veteran and was a police officer in the Air Force, and then spent 2,000 years as a cop in the civilian sector, I think, and retired as a police chief. Was a chief at a couple of different places, a captain at a couple of different places. I think involved in other more dangerous things like SRT teams and SWAT and like that and now owns a company called Secure Measures, where he does a lot of training for law enforcement agencies, including Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and others. And for some inexplicable reason, I'm on the call. I do not know why. I don't have the experience of these guys by any stretch of the imagination. I was a director of security at a couple of big companies. One was Toyota Motor Sales USA at one time back in the early 80s, and that was a big deal. They were in Torrance, which they're not anymore. And then I led the security team at my church for 10 years. And it was a pretty good sized church with about 2,500 members in attendance. Let's see, I've owned a security company where we did largely executive protection and some bomb work with the company that Dave owned at the time and doesn't anymore. Did a lot of dog work and some narcotics detection and that kind of stuff, which was cool. We had Bechtel as a client. We had Planned Parenthood as a client and some others. So we did some work, and we did some EP work for some minor celebrities here in San Diego who were getting threats all the time. And I generally led those teams, which was kind of cool. I was a bail bondsman for a while for Acme Bail Bonds. So I've written a lot of bonds. So not only have I thrown people in jail, but I've let them out. So while these guys were running around catching bad guys, throwing them in jail, I'm the evil guy who was getting them back out again. And so I did that. And then, of course, once in a while, they FTA, they fail to appear, and then you have to go get them. And no, it's not like Dog the Bounty Hunter. That guy's an idiot. That's reality TV, which bears no sense of reality. So and then I own Practical Defense Systems. I've owned for 16 years. We've got a little over 28,000 students we've trained so far. And we're in San Diego, and largely security and concealed security courses and concealed weapons and like that. So there you go. Now you've got the history of the knuckleheads on the call. We have a list of things to talk about, which may be interesting to you. I'll start off by saying I was telling them, I have my Kill Bad Dudes hat on because we're going to talk about bad dudes today. This was given to me by my son who works for Half Face Blades. I think he got it at work or something, but it's a Bass Pro Shop thing, but it says Kill Bad Dudes on it, which is kind of funny. So I got a kick out of it. I don't wear it in public very much because in California, you get all kinds of, I could do it in Arizona, but around here, you get all kinds of hate. All right. Well, anyway, on our list, we talked about a few things, and the thing I wanted to open with was just the idea that at some point, we've talked about law enforcement zero, which is your term, Scott, and we've talked about the struggle that law enforcement has right now just to keep people or recruit people or keep institutional knowledge that seems to be going out the door. And that's not good for public safety. I'm just going to say it. And if you're watching this and you disagree with that, I think you might want to reevaluate that. having ill-equipped or not, or poorly equipped or poorly experienced police is not good for public safety. But at some point, something has to fill those gaps. So we talked about what citizens ought to be doing for themselves to ensure their own safety in such an environment if we keep going down this road, which I hope we won't. And first on the list here is the evolution of the threats and how things are changing from the way they used to be. And since Dave is in my upper left corner, we'll get him first. What are your thoughts, Dave, on where the threats are now to the public and as far as public safety is concerned, and as opposed to where it's been and where are we headed?
Well, I'll start off here in LA with some of the challenges we've been having currently on our public transit. And the reason I'm sharing that is because there has been some discussions from our city leaders in Los Angeles regarding the 2028 Olympics that are going to be coming to Los Angeles and the desire to use mostly public transportation. More recently, there have been numerous, and I think this is, nationwide news at this point. There have been repeated security failures all along our metro buses, our trains, all of those things to the point where I believe over the weekend, there was an incident that I shared with Scott, where a gentleman was trying near the metro train tracks, was trying to throw a woman into traffic on the 210 freeway. And the question is, transit officers from sheriff's department showed up fairly quickly to this particular call. But the reality is that has become a real blight on the city and county in terms of safety and security. We have a lot of people that ride our trains and buses and all of those things. And I think that's a big threat, to public safety. And because they're now Metro's looking to, what was interesting is Metro came out and said they want to start their own police department. And because they currently contract with the sheriff's department, LAPD, Long Beach PD for all of their routes. Well, what's interesting is here in LA, we're all fishing from the same pond for applicants. Where
Yeah.
are they thinking they're going to hire the 500 plus officers they're likely going to need to secure the trains? And will that happen before the 2028 Olympics? I'm not entirely sure. Bureaucracy, the
I'm
wheels of
not
bureaucracy
hopeful
move
personally.
slow.
Yeah.
Um, but I think, if that's the one thing that stands out in my mind right now as kind of a serious concern, it's that. Our transit systems are not secure here in Los Angeles, and I suspect this is happening in other larger cities that might have some challenges, but it seems to be more pronounced in LA County, and I'm not sure why. But I think our population density, and I think it's a combination of things. I think it's the lack of prosecution for certain crimes. I think it's the lack of law enforcement or the ability to provide law enforcement. They provide security, I think, in the form of ambassadors. And I know both of your feelings about the whole ambassador program. I think they're better. That money is better spent providing actual folks that can do something. Um,
Is this
rather than
situation
just,
is with the
yeah.
transit, is it new or has it been around for a long time?
Well, ironically, years and years and years ago, they used to have Metro Police, or whatever it was called at the time. They used to have Metro Police, and then they got rid of it because it was becoming cost prohibitive, I guess. And then they decided to contract out to local law enforcement agencies. However, now they're gravitating back to that. And I don't, nobody knows what the answer is. Their former security director or the director of Metro Security was a former FBI, FBI. I think she was an ASAC, Scott. I'm not
Right.
sure, but Gina Osborne. And, she had sort of a contentious relationship with Metro leadership. And there were a lot of things that happened, and unfortunately, she was unceremoniously let go, which I don't think was a good decision on Metro's part, because if you're clearly having security issues, you don't want to let go the senior security leader who's leading those efforts and trying to corral things. Now you're leaving a vacuum,
Yeah.
and that causes, I think, more problems, just in my own personal opinion. So I think there's a lot of challenges there, and they've been long-standing. But unfortunately, I think they've been voiced, which I'm suspecting is why Gina is no longer there, is because she voiced those things to folks, and they went unheard.
So I guess the question is, I think what you're describing is exactly, to use your term, you're describing what's filled the vacuum. I mean, if we have ambassadors trying to do police officers' work, that's not going to work, and it hasn't worked. And like you said, you already know my opinion. You know Scott's opinion, and
Yeah.
I think we're on the same page, all three of us. But now you have sort of a vacuum of that's been filled by what? And I think it's being filled by this kind of behavior. By the way, if you haven't seen the video of this man trying to throw this woman into traffic, she literally is picking her up and swinging her, trying to toss her in front of a moving vehicle. And only by the narrowest of margins was she kept from being killed.
Mhm.
That's getting pretty tragic. What are your thoughts on the same thing? Where are we going, Scott? And as opposed to where we've been, and is there a, I guess, is there an off ramp from where we're going? I'm not seeing one.
Well, I think we have to ask ourselves, why are we seeing this more? Because if you look statistically at what the FBI provides for crime rates in the United States, the most violent crime is down. And but then we look across our social media spectrum and it doesn't appear to be, because we're seeing these horrible things. That's something that I call the body camera effect. And it's mainly driven through social media. And I'm not suggesting that, oh, because we're seeing it more often in social media, that it's actually an increase in there's a conspiracy to from the FBI to decrease these things. I just think that reported numbers don't reflect the experiences of most metropolitan Americans. You know, folks who are living in maybe smaller towns or out in rural areas probably aren't seeing the volume and velocity of issues that we're seeing in large metropolitan areas that are incredibly impacted not only by homelessness or people experiencing homelessness and crime, but they're doubly impacted in that in the late 2010s they were told, "Hey, we're going to defund the police, and we're not going to pay you as much, or we're going to provide different resources." And I don't have an issue with providing mental health assessment teams, but when you tell law enforcement officers that they don't matter, and then you expect them to show up to work with the same vigor and aggression that you would want them to have, you can't be surprised when they're like, well, if you don't need me, then I'm just going to drive around with my windows rolled up in my cruiser and not pay attention to things and not be proactive. That obviously is not every officer. I'm using kind of a broad swatch there, but what we're experiencing, I think, is largely driven by media and social media. The headlines and our ability to communicate with each other is so different than it was even 10 years ago. Now, obviously, everybody not only has a camera in their hand, but there's cameras on buildings, and we're able to get, great ring camera video of these situations happening. The CCTV surveillance video is incredible, and you get multiple angles of an incident now. So perspective, I think, is better. And when I look at these things, my assessment is that one, it's obviously much more in our face, and two, I do think that things like homelessness or folks who are homeless experiencing mental health crisis is way more in our face, and it's not being reported, or it is being reported and law enforcement isn't showing up in time to document that as an incident. And so folks are GOA, right? Gone on arrival. And so I think we're just seeing it more often, but it's not being documented as appropriately as it should.
Is that partly because law
Scott.
enforcement isn't there quick enough to do it, or partly because citizens simply aren't reporting it, or both?
I think it's both. I mean, how often do we hear citizens calling 911 and getting placed on hold, or the joke in Arizona that goes to voicemail? I think there's some serious concerns there, because you call 911, you expect to get a human, and then the expectation is, by the way, and this is worse in California than it is almost probably anywhere else. Expectation is that within 5 to 15 minutes that you'll have law enforcement there. I think that's what the public expects. I don't think that's unreasonable, by the way, because folks pay their taxes and they expect to have some result for paying their taxes. Firefighters are required, by the way, to show up within 5 minutes of a call in most metropolitan areas. So, why is it different for law enforcement, or why is there a different standard and different measurements? With the expectation from the public, we're just doing a horrible job at ROI, return on investment. And that's why I say it's worse in California, because they all pay more taxes.
Well, and to your point, I think the difference is illustrated, for example, in the neighborhood in which I live. I live in a very nice neighborhood, very low crime. And one of the reasons it's very low crime is because the police will respond in 2 minutes to 3 minutes, and that's it. And they deal with it. And there are other parts of the same city that I live in that they don't do that in, because it's a kind of a rat's nest, and they're not as fast as they would be. But they vigorously and jealously protect this neighborhood because they don't want that to end up over here. They'd like to kind of make the rest of the city the same way, so they're trying to push it out, if that makes any sense. So where you have a vigorous and active law enforcement presence, where the citizens support the police officers, which in my neighborhood they do. So when the cops come out here, they know that the people who live here support them. And so there's that also, I think there's that emotional support, which is a good thing. We don't have much crime. But if I go, 5 minutes, 10 minutes in certain directions, the crime rate goes up dramatically, because they don't support the police in a lot of cases. And the police, as a result, are not as and I think on the opening end, on the front end, they don't support the police. On the back end, they want to crucify them if they do their job. So when you're in the middle of that, and you're the cop in the patrol car, you're right. You're rolling up the windows and you're just driving your beat, but you're kind of not wanting to do much, because if you do, you're not going to get the support from the citizenry. And you're going to get crucified for doing it in the media, and then your department may not stand behind you as they would at one time. Are you seeing similar things, Dave, or is this just a unique perspective on my part and Scott's?
No, I was going to kind of piggyback on what Scott was saying. When you kind of look at the FBI crime stats, they're saying, violent crime is down and different things are down. I think it's from more of a lack of reporting, because, in a lot of ways, because there's, certain things aren't getting prosecuted. And I know we have some prosecutors, famously, especially ours here in LA, who seem to really not prosecute not a lot of things, or outwardly facing. And, clearly he's facing recalls and scrutiny and other things. But I would argue that I think people are tired of reporting things and not getting a response. And they also feel kind of like, it took law enforcement 2 hours to get here because they're shorthanded. And then now when the cops finally get there, it's really after the fact, and they're just going to take a report, and, it's going to get put on some overworked detective's desk, who's going to try to work it if it's a burglary or something. And I'll give you an example. I read another story that a store that provides security stuff like Byrna's and OC was broken into in Van Nuys. And they broke in and they were in his store for 22 minutes. 22 minutes, according to the news. And, his mindset is, these folks that are burglarizing these areas no longer care. Because they know the police are shorthanded, and they know likely if they are caught, they're going to get a slap on the wrist and let go because of things like Prop 47 and 57. So, it's really a terrible combination of things that's causing this, or causing, the appearance of crime rates to come down. I just don't think they're being reported because people don't really feel there's going to be any resolution. They just suck it up and fix it and move on. If, as an example, if they got burglarized, they just fix whatever got broken. They try and reinforce what to do because they have to fend for themselves because the system that is designed to help them is not helping them.
Well, I think you've just given us a great segue into the next question. Is now we know there's a gap.
It's what I do.
Yeah, and you're doing a great job, by the way. I'm handing you my kill dude's hat. You can kill bad dude's hat right through the camera there.
I love it.
So what do you think is going to fill the gap? I know I've seen, we train security people, everything from the, young kid who's walking the parking lot of Walmart to, I had a guy coming through requalifying for a permit who works for Gavin DeBecker doing executive protection. Another guy's getting ready to retire from the Navy. He's a firearms instructor, and he's already got a job working on an executive protection detail for a very famous guy who, if I won't mention, but if I did, you'd exactly know who this gentleman is. He's a billionaire, and so he's already going to be on his protection team. Now, whether that's protecting one of his many houses or actually walking around with a guy, I mean, that depends on where he gets assigned, but these are pretty high end security people. So we get everybody, regardless of that, across that swath of security. Does security have a place, do you think, in filling some of the gaps here where law enforcement isn't? And if so, what are your thoughts? And I guess we'll start with Scott here.
Yeah, you've heard, and everybody's heard, and I was talking about this last week, law enforcement zero, and I hesitate and even call it security zero. We're losing generations of law enforcement and security professionals as the baby boomers mass into retirement. And we don't have generations that are big enough to support those positions that they're going to leave. So while we can say, or we want to say, yeah, as we lose our law enforcement partners to retirement, and by the way, some agencies will be impacted more greatly than others. The expectation is that private security will fill the gaps. And we've seen this to some extent in, let's say, big box stores and retail, where they know they can't get law enforcement to respond to a non-violent theft. So they have their own security in the parking lots. They have security in the stores and things like that, trying to mitigate those impacts. And I was at South Coast Plaza, which is a very high-end mall in Southern California, and it's all the major high-end brands from around the world that have a storefront in this mall. Every single store had somebody at the door. They didn't say they were security. Some were uniformed security, but their doors were all closed, and they had somebody like a doorman or door person at the door, and they looked like security people. Some of them had ear loops, with a radio. And so it was fascinating to me because I worked there back in the early 90s. It was fascinating for me to walk through there again and see the securitization of high net worth retail shopping. And we've seen this on Rodeo Drive as well, a reliance on private security to shore up where law enforcement just can't or won't go. And so I think initially there will be, hey, we'll just hire more security. And the problem is going to happen probably by 2030. There isn't even any more security to humans to do this work, or not enough. So when we say private security, I think we have to evolve our mindset to include physical security. And that's everything from designing a security entry procedure, or designing an experience in a retail establishment that appears to be more secure, without having more humans. And it can be anything from electronic tags on every piece of merchandise to cabling expensive items to stands and things like that, as well as cameras and computing at the edge, and artificial intelligence, machine learning, facial recognition, things that we see in casinos coming to the common open spaces of America. I think we're just going to see that in application much, much more, because we're not going to have law enforcement. So while we say private security, and the image that pops into our head is the security guard in the golf cart in the parking lot, I think that's going to have to evolve to, night scope robots, for example, more cameras, more access control. And, as I was speaking about law enforcement zero, somebody brought up, Why does Walmart have such a high retail theft problem and Costco does not? And I said membership has its privilege. To get into the retail establishment, you have to have a card with your picture on it, and they check that. People I think are a lot less uh, apt to steal from a place where they have to show their ID. And I'm not suggesting that Walmart should do that. I'm just saying it's an interesting data point.
No, and I think you're seeing more of that just in corporate office buildings. For example, where our office is in Rio Vista Tower in the Hyundai building. As far as I know, Hyundai owns that building, I think. But that's an access controlled building. So we're on the eighth floor. My card, well, for that matter, Dave's, will only take us to one parking lot where we can park, and it will only take us to the first floor and the eighth floor. It won't take us to any of the Hyundai floors. And so depending on where your office is, it will take you to the floor where your office is. So it's a very robust access controlled building. Now, I mean, obviously those things can be overcome. But if you walk in, the security guard there is a nice kid, but he's useless if anything dangerous was to occur. But if anything, they're redesigning. One of the things they're doing is redesigning the entire lobby, which is going to be kind of cool. But I think they're going to increase the access control, their control of the access control while they do it. I remember when they installed the new elevators, I don't know, a couple of years ago. It drove me nuts because there's no buttons on the inside of the elevator. You got to hit your pass, it beeps, and you pick your floor, and then it opens, and it takes you to that floor, not 6 other floors, and you can't change it along the way. So I would pick my floor, get in the elevator, and go, and there's no buttons to push. It drove me nuts for like 6 months. But I suspect we're going to see more of that. And I think you're right. People forget that security isn't just human bodies. It's all these other things. The question then becomes, if you have AI involved and you've got more cameras and you've got robotics and robots rolling around, walking around, whatever, Dave, who do they report to? I mean, at some point when you don't have human beings to show up to deal with the issue, it's nice to have all these surveillance things, but what happens when something happens?
So I want to share kind of an article that I was reading this morning and kind of a relation to the question you asked. And this is about the state of security in Oregon. Since 2020, new statistics show the number of certified private security guards in Oregon allowed to carry a weapon has increased 39%.
Wow. Okay.
Well, and clearly, and I would suspect that that's the case for a lot of security entities, just in general, and kind of going back to Scott's point, you're bringing in, you're bringing in a lot of different organizations to help, like at West Coast Plaza and, all of these different places. But what's the model? Well, with law enforcement going to law enforcement zero, I think there is more of a reliance on private security. However, I'm going to make a statement that I know both of you will concur with, which is security is only as good as the people doing it, and B, how well trained they are.
Yeah.
And I think that matters in a lot of cases. I'll give you an example of this. And I'm gonna give a shout out to Covered Six, and Chris Dunn and his team. He's done amazing things, and I would argue that what they've done with, as an example, their partnership with Beverly Hills, and how he trains his folks, and he routinely picks, veterans, former first responders, and other folks that have some level of experience. Not to say all of his team are those folks. I'm sure there's some go-getters out there that don't have either, but he puts them through a comprehensive training program, and then he partners with local jurisdictions, and they've been rolling out pilots and things with cities like Beverly Hills. How do we work collaboratively as security and law enforcement to help keep the city safe, right? And there are things security is allowed to do, and there are certain things they're not allowed to do, and that's okay. But the point is that not a lot of jurisdictions have that mindset. And I think that's a disservice. But I would also argue and that some cities don't want to deal with the liability of a poorly trained security officer because we all know, a lot of security companies do not invest the kind of time for a variety of reasons, but more importantly, cities don't want to take on that liability of, hey, this is a poorly trained guy. I don't want them dealing with a trespasser, or I don't want them. I just need them to stand here in front of the store and provide some level of deterrence. It that mindset, like Scott was saying, that's no longer a deterrent. That one security guard who's standing in front of a flash mob that runs into Neiman Marcus isn't doing anything, you know? So where do we go from here? I think, and kind of segueing into your question, Joel, like I think it's a blend of things. I really think that you have to have a minimum security standard. As our friend Carlos normally shares, you have to have a minimum security standard for your organization. And what does that look like? Right? You have to evaluate what your resource is, how you're going to protect it, and what types of things are going to be useful in that effort. Maybe it's rearranging the front of the store so people just can't come in and out. Maybe it is using a membership card like Costco. There's a lot of different ways to do this, but what's going to be beneficial? Because what are most retailers and what are most organizations worried about? Oh, we need to make it look aesthetically pleasing and we need to make sure it's welcoming and we need to have all these things, which I'm not saying you shouldn't from a customer service perspective. But I think many organizations need to educate themselves on modern day security practices and figure out how to implement them in a way that doesn't impact their bottom line. And look at, and Joel, you brought up Walmart. Well, you know, Walmart has been under fire lately too because they want to check people's receipts on the way out.
Mhm.
And they're doing what they can to
Something that
minimize
Costco's been
shrink,
doing since
right?
3 days before
Yep.
dinner. Back when it was Price Club, they used to do that, right?
But I've seen viral posts on, Instagram and other places with people outraged. I love that word. I think that word is being overused
Yeah.
heavily. Everybody's outraged about something, and it's like, really? Are you really outraged about it, or was it a minor inconvenience that you just wanted attention for? I don't think it's an outrage for them to try to protect their inventory or to make sure that what you're leaving with, because as we've seen a bunch of people walk into stores, fill up a shopping cart, and walk out.
Yeah.
We've seen this on video. There's numerous examples of that. So they're doing what they can. Are there other ways that they could shift their posture? Potentially. But the reality is, I think there's a combination of things. And I really think organizations need to have a blend of humans and technology to do this.
We've changed in our culture a lot over the last 250 years or something. There was a time, when I go back home to the United States in Arizona, Scott, and I leave the People's Socialist Republic of California, and I go up to our place, which is in Apache County. We're not far from Show Low, which is in Navajo County. The Apache County sheriff's last name is Deadman. Does that tell you anything? Joseph Deadman. Okay. I've never met the man, but I hope he stays sheriff as long as he wants to, because it's just kind of cool to have a sheriff named Deadman. I don't even know if he's a good sheriff, but his name's Deadman. That's good enough for me. Everybody has a gun in the glove box or center console or on them or whatever. If you get stopped by a cop, they always ask you for your driver's license and all the other usual things. And where do you keep your gun in the truck? And if you say you don't have one, they look at you like you're lying to them because everybody's got one. They expect you to have one. That's kind of normal in that area. And then out where we are, it's a lot of cattle ranchers, and we're 21, 22 miles down the county road before you get to the cattle gate, and another 3 or 4 miles before you get to our property. We're out in the middle of nowhere. And our address, when I wanted to get a zip code for our address, the post office said, yeah, when I look up the zip code map, that whole area you're out there in Elk Valley, that says unknown. I said, what zip code do I use? Well, you can use this one or you can use that one. Which one do you want to use? And I just ask my neighbors and look to see what they're using and we're using that one, right? So we actually have an address, but we don't have mail delivery because we're out there. And, she said, a gal at the post office said, well, I like to ride my horse to work periodically. So if you need mail, I can run it out there. It'll be like the Pony Express. And that's Arizona. So it's a different world. You get in these metropolitan areas like Maricopa County, down there in Phoenix or whatever, or you get in Los Angeles or San Diego and the world changes dramatically. And that's because there's more police service. I was Googling it because, Google knows all, apparently. I wanted to know when the first police department started in the United States. And according to Google, the first one was in Boston in 1838, and then followed by New York in 1844, and followed by Philadelphia in 1854. Now, that does not mean that in the mid to late 1800s, we had police departments in every city, because we didn't. And we certainly didn't have police departments in rural areas. And we certainly didn't have police departments in territories. My great Aunt Peggy, whom I knew very well and loved, was born in 1888 in Indian Territory, Oklahoma. Okay. There wasn't no police department out there. And what am I getting to? I'll get to it. I'm sorry, I'm a little long-winded here. I think as a culture, there was a time when citizens knew that their safety and security was on them for the most part. And then we've gotten to the point probably since about 1920 or 1930 or something, maybe in, early 1900s, where police departments became prevalent and we shifted our security responsibility away from the individual to the government, basically, and said, you guys are going to keep us safe. I'm looking at where we're going. Do you feel like there needs to be a culture, a mindset shift or a cultural shift for both citizens and companies and stores and so on? Do we need to shift back more? I don't think we need to make 180-degree shift back to we're all responsible for our own safety all the time, 100%, and the cops are never going to show. But do we at least need to make more of a cultural shift where mentally and emotionally we grasp a coming reality where we're going to need to be more like the pre-law enforcement days, in the sense that you are responsible for you and you are responsible for your store, and less dependent upon government to keep everything safe? Is that the direction we're going? What are your thoughts?
Yeah,
Scott?
I'm a big fan of personal responsibility, and always have been. And I think there is a tremendous reliance on the government, and we used to have a tremendous distrust for the government. And
I'm going to interrupt you and say some of us still do. But
it was okay. A good balance. It was just a good balance, and I think it was actually sooner than your dates. I'm putting it right after World War II, as the United States is offering guarantees to our partners in Europe that we would be the world police. We would secure the seas and secure the transit lanes and supply chains, and we would build infrastructure like the Panama Canal, and we would enforce those rules and kind of tamp down the rogue nations. And we've had that agreement for the past 50 years, longer than that, 70 years.
Yeah.
So the challenge now is we've gotten to a place where we rely on the government for our things and for our safety and for medical care and on and on and on. And so I think it's just a natural evolution of moving off of the farm or the ranch and into the city. I've said this before in regards to Law Enforcement Zero. More and more people are moving from rural to residential or suburban or cities, because that's where the jobs are, especially jobs that don't include having to know how to operate a post holer or a shovel, and knowing how to work a computer. So the more technical we've gotten, the less resilient we've gotten, and I think that's going to continue exponentially. Postal service is one aspect of government service that is leaving rural areas. And before long, you're just going to have to go to the post office once a week and pick up your mail in rural areas. And they're not going to have enough people to deliver it.
I'm a
So
little concerned. You mean that gal's not going to get on her horse and bring us our mail out there in
I
the
would
valley
ask
out there?
her how long she has till retirement, because that will give you an indication. You
She
know,
said, it's beautiful out where your property is. I know where your property is. I ride my horse out there all the time. I said, are you riding your horse across my property? She said, I'll never tell.
yeah, and you'd probably never know either. Your
No,
property's so big.
no, I'd never know. Even if I was there, I wouldn't know. It's a lot of acreage. I don't know where they actually at. It's hilarious.
And honestly, I do think that Americans do care for each other. We see this in the community emergency response teams and volunteer firefighters. By the way, there are more volunteer firefighters in the United States than there are paid firefighters. That's incredible that people would give their life as a firefighter in a volunteer capacity. Many of those are in rural communities, but you have greater concerns in rural communities because you don't have water where you need it. You can't just tap a fire hydrant. Anyways, but so I think Americans like to take care of each other, and there is a capacity, at least for some, that want to continue to serve, even if it's in an unpaid capacity. And that's where we have to accelerate things. I was at an event just last night talking to very young people of the Jewish faith, and they're all about protecting their communities and protecting each other and protecting their own. And they talked about being in Israel and what's currently going on and how their community is coming out and not just supporting each other in a security capacity, but in medically supporting each other and firefighting and things like that. And we all know why that's happening right now, but I think in the United States we have the capacity. We have the people who want to volunteer. Government often, this might be a surprise to y'all, gets in the way of that. And I don't know that it's intentional. I think it's yeah, Dave's like, no.
Dave. Surely not.
No way. Well, and I think both Dave and I are recovering bureaucrats, right? So we know what it's like to be in law enforcement and government and wanting to support your constituents and wanting to help. Government doesn't always understand that the private part of public-private partnership.
So this brings up an interesting question, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, Scott, but you brought up a few things that are just really key, I think. If I look at the difference between where I'm sitting now in San Diego County and where I would be sitting in Apache County, Arizona, the mindset of the citizen, because it's all cattle ranchers and, small ranches like mine and like that. And I mean small. My neighbor's got 55,000 acres he runs cattle on, and I've got 40. So there you are, right?
Yeah.
But you know that the soonest that a deputy is going to show up and help you is depending on when you got a sheriff's department's probably got 25 employees, maybe. And I think that's one thing people don't realize is the overwhelming majority of law enforcement agencies have 25 or fewer officers around the country. We're so used to, if we live in a major metropolitan area, these enormous police departments, but most of them are very, very small. They might have 8, 10, they might have 2, 3, 4 deputies. They might have 8, 10 police officers or something. That's about it. Well, I think that department out there might have 25 employees. That doesn't mean he's got 25 sworn. That means he's got 25 employees. So at any given time, there might be 1 or 2 deputies on in that entire county. And if they're on the other side of the county and you call for help, they're an hour and a half, 2 hours before they're going to get there. Minimum, maybe more. And so in areas like that, both law enforcement and the citizens understand that. And so you don't get this. As a citizen, you dealt with whatever you needed to deal with, and then the deputy rolls in 2 hours later, and the deputy doesn't say, well, how come you didn't wait for us to come take care of it? You should have waited. You're under arrest. No, I mean, if you shot some guy who they've been looking for a while or who has been a problem child for a long time, the deputy's more likely to roll up, see the dead guy, and go, well, finally, somebody shot that SOB. That's going to be the end. Kill the bad dude, right? I mean, I'm not saying it's a license to shoot people. I'm just saying that the mindset is different. Whereas if you're here and you deal with whatever you deal with, the government response is, oh, no, no, no. That's not your responsibility. You were supposed to wait until we came and dealt with it. And if you got killed, that's your problem. You needed to call us and sit down, shut up, and wait for us to come address it. And because you didn't, now you're under arrest and you're the criminal. So the question then becomes, even in metropolitan areas, I'm of the opinion there needs to be a mindset and culture shift away from dependency upon the government by the citizens. But does there also need to be a mindset and culture change from the government point of view that allows more latitude for citizens to deal with what law enforcement either cannot or won't? What are your thoughts, Dave?
Well, I'm gonna put my student loans to work here, because I think that's necessary. But when we talk about things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Your basic needs, right?
It
I
went over
know.
my head. I didn't, obviously, I need a student loan. I'm sorry.
I learned one thing. No, I'm just kidding. Uh, uh, but when we start talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, certainly there's some some things that are obvious, food, water, those type of things. But the very next level up is safety and security. And I really think that, and I'm very much in line with Scott and you in terms of you need to be responsible for yourself. You're responsible for yourself on a lot of other levels, like paying your bills or getting your driver's license or a lot of these other ancillary things. But you should also be focused on your own safety and security, and not that you have to be paranoid, and scoping things out every day, but be aware of the threats, risks, and hazards that exist out there, knowing what your crime rates are in your city, taking an interest in those things and then acting accordingly, right? Many people just get an alarm system or they get a doorbell camera or they get things because they need it. But also educating yourself, understanding that, your doorbell camera isn't designed, it's there to record an incident. That's what it's there for. It's to document. It's not there necessarily. It could be a deterrent. And some people who don't want to be captured on film, it's going to deter them. Those who don't care, it's there to document those folks. It's not going to prevent an incident because I think a lot of people have misconceptions around, oh, if I put in a camera, nobody's ever going to break into my house ever again. And that's very, very, very far
Well, I
from
think
the
there
truth.
used to be an idea of a path of least resistance and scarecrows. And to both of your points, the security guard standing at the store used to be a scarecrow. And having the cameras and like that used to be oh gee, I won't break into that one. I'll get into the one down the street because the one down the street doesn't have cameras, isn't well lit. That's the path of least resistance. I'm not sure that concept even matters anymore to a lot of people. I mean, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are in that regard as well.
Going back to your comment about we need to shift our mindset, we absolutely do. And I think especially our state certifying bodies and how we administrate security services here I'll talk California in more specific.
Yeah.
I'm not fortunate enough to own any property in Arizona yet. So, I'm in the company of greatness at the moment.
Well, you and I got to get out there and build you a cabin on my property.
Yes,
on the other end of the property. I won't know you're there. You won't know I'm there. It'll feel like you own it.
I love that. But I
give you the
think
key to the gate.
but given Scott's law enforcement zero concept, I think security now starts to need to evolve to a higher level. And what that looks like, maybe there's a mid-tier, there were years and years and years ago, some organizations had things called special officers,
Yeah.
and they had some very limited, law enforcement type of capabilities, like they could cite people for municipal codes, or they work for the city. I think we need to start bringing some of that back. Very, just like the Air Force just brought back warrant officers, right? The Air Force just reactivated something that they hadn't had because they're doing a lot of force realignment. I think we need to do that in the security industry as a whole. Again, going back to covered six, like Chris really has sort of a good model for that public-private partnership, and how to evolve those things, because it's going to take partnerships and collaborations to address a lot of the crime and issues that we're having. No one organization can do it on their own anymore. And that's
Is this
the
a
reality.
chicken and the egg thing? And the reason I ask that is because, Dave, to your point, you're right. Covered six has a great model. I mean, they really, really do. What I see is so many security companies are just checking the box that in California that the Bureau of Security and Investigative Services requires them to check. And the three of us on this call, I think, are in agreement that nobody takes BSIS seriously, because all of their requirements are about as unserious as you could possibly get. And the day of the security guard's main responsibility being observe and report are gone. People don't want to hire security people who are just going to observe and report. People want to hire security people who are going to mitigate, who are going to be actively involved, who are going to stop threats and that kind of stuff. And then you get into the security, the covered six model, which is different, which means somebody has to either be a chicken or lay an egg. I mean, but which is it going to be? Is it going to be you get the contract and then you go train everybody and you get them all trained up to fit the contract? Or do you do, I think, as covered six is, which is, let me build it and get it ready, and then I'm going to go find contracts where these guys can work? I suspect that the latter model is the only one that will work. I don't think you're going to be able to go find companies who will pay you to provide services you cannot provide in the hope that you can go put them together and provide them. So that's my thought. It's got to be, what is the old that movie, if you build it, they'll come, right? I mean, does the security company need to build it first? Do they need to invest the money to do that? Is that where we're at? That's what I'm thinking.
Well,
That's been my experience.
Kind of going back to, when we talk about BSIS, well, keep in mind, California has probably one of the more rigid standards around the country as it relates to security, which is interesting.
True, yeah.
Right? There are other states that you can just show up. I mean, the standards are not uniform, across the United States, which, it's not surprising we have these regulations here in California, because they all cost something, and that helps generate revenue, right?
Yep.
But I think you're right in terms of, I think you need to build it and then you need to sell it. And you're going to find some I think more of late, you're going to find some more willing participants because of that. I think the thing that will hamstring folks is there's an associated cost, and that's the biggest factor. That's the biggest factor is, can we afford it? Can we afford that level of security? Which is why you end up with the low paid security officer that we've seen, dressed like a duffel bag, doesn't really take pride in their appearance, doesn't really show any level of proactivity, because to them, it's just, hey, this is just my job. I'm not invested in this type of work. So I'm just here, and if something happens, hey, it is what it is.
Well, and you and I both own security companies, Dave, and so we're aware of the fact that so much of it is driven by the lowest bidder.
Yeah.
And you're always fighting that. And anytime you're trying to get anybody to do anything more than that, they always close the barn door after the horses get loose. They don't.
Yep.
They're not willing to do it ahead of time. Can we shift just a little bit away from security companies and more to people? Because this affects not just businesses and security organizations and law enforcement organizations, but it affects the average Joe and Jane, where they live and what they do on their, as they're going through their day. Most citizens, I think, I can't speak for most citizens, but I would suspect that most of them would like to just go through their day and do their daily whatever and be unmolested in the process. And so we've been dependent upon law enforcement to make that happen for a long time. Obviously, that's not going to continue, it doesn't seem. So on a obviously on an individual basis, there's things like if you're in a state where you can just put a gun in your pocket and go get some training, put a gun in your pocket and go. You're in a state like California where you got to get a permit, put a gun in your pocket and go. Or if you don't want to carry a deadly weapon, there's other options. You can buy a taser, civilian taser. I think they call it the taser pulse. You can buy pepper spray. You can buy whatever, and take some classes on being aware of your surroundings and make good choices and all that stuff. And you can do all the things we talked about with your house. You can, the old thing about the 3 Ls: lights, locks, landscaping. Try to put things together to protect your home to the degree that you can. And buy a shotgun, as bumbling Biden would say. But now you're in a community, and both of you have brought up that word, I think, in this conversation: community. In fact, Scott, I think you talked about the young Jewish men, women, whatever, talking about their community. How important is knowing your neighbor and developing some sort of community, even if you live in a burb or you live in an urban area? I mean, we're good at that in rural areas. I know my neighbor north of me. I know the neighbor east of me. I don't have one south of me or west of me. I'm sorry, I know the neighbor west of me. I don't have one east of me or south of me, because that's all Arizona public land. But I know the neighbors out there, and we know our neighbors here. Everybody knows everybody. But I think in suburbs, that's not as common as it used to be. Is that also a cultural shift that we ought to see if we would like to stay safe? And if so, why?
It's interesting. We've gone from knowing your neighbors to neighborhood watches. But remember when we used to have block parties back in the 70s and 80s, and everyone would bring a potluck, and that's where you would get to know your neighbors, at least in suburbia where I grew up. So now we have that just in electronic form. We've got electronic neighborhood watch, and it's in the form of a Facebook page or sharing Instagram or something. And so it's interesting how it's evolved from being in person to now everything is online. It's a WhatsApp thread, or it's where people can share pictures and video and experiences. And for example, it just happened in my community. Law enforcement was blocking a street in our community, and there was a street sweeper going up and down the street. And I thought, that's kind of weird that they're blocking the street for a street sweeper. But sure enough, on the Facebook page and for our community, somebody had shared that there was a vehicle fire. So, no longer do we have to wait to get together in person, and you have that rumor mill that circulates, and sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. Now we can communicate with hundreds, if not thousands, of people with social media. So it's an interesting evolution. And people are sharing. We've had some kind of crazy situations in our community, and people are sharing their Ring doorbell footage. Hey, did y'all see this? Hey, have you seen this person? They tried to, break into my car, or whatever the situation is. So those kinds of things have gone from in person to online. And now there's, like I talked about volume and velocity before, there's much more volume there. And there's maybe even better volume. We've got neighborhood watch type apps that almost anybody who's in the neighborhood can now stay abreast of things. And it's not always crime related. Sometimes it's, hey, Amazon dropped off a package at the wrong house. Is this somebody else's? So I think it can be really helpful. It's kind of neat to see that. And I think people are much more comfortable sharing, obviously, online, and maybe there's goods and bads of that. But I think if we can share more often and provide value, that those are good ways to keep your community aware, because it's going to take the community. No longer are we going to be able to rely on others. We have to rely on each other. The interesting change is we've got a generation of people coming up, millennials and Gen Z, that are much more comfortable with technology.
Mhm.
Gen Z, by the way, would much rather be coding in their mom's basement than actually meeting somebody in person.
Yeah.
So it's likely not going to go away. And I think that's okay because the pandemic taught us, or the lockdowns really taught us, that Graham can figure out technology if she wants to go to church. So
Yeah.
here we are. How do we continue to leverage technology to help each other? Now, I like, and you guys do this too, I like leveraging technology to help train and educate people.
Mhm.
You know, y'all have the great the simulators for firearms and experiences, which I think are better than static shooting on the range, where you're actually getting into an environment and testing your response technique, not just against time, but against a real situation. So technology is going to be that great leverage that everybody's going to use to evolve and adapt and be resilient.
Does this extend in community to, and that's from an informational standpoint, keeping everybody abreast of what's going on and that kind of stuff? You're right. I mean, we have there's an app, I can't remember the name of it, that pretty much everybody in this area uses, and I'll find out what's going on 3 streets down the road because somebody will put up there that they lost their cat, or somebody, there's a porch pirate that took something, and they'll have a picture of the porch pirate. And if you see this guy, well, the next thing you know, because of the neighborhood we're in, somebody will see the porch pirate, call the cop, and the cop will come by and scoop him up. They don't tolerate that around here, and I'm grateful. But in a lot of neighborhoods, that's not the case, as we've discussed. You call the cops and they either can't be there, won't be there. I mean, when police departments are putting out lists of crime calls they no longer respond to, that's pretty tragic. So, from a community perspective, when do we, how do we in suburban areas get to the point where your neighbor needs help, either medical or because somebody's busting in their house or because they're getting beat up in the front yard or whatever, and the community comes together and goes over and deals with it because the cops are not going to show? I mean, Dave, you live here in California. And you ran a police department or two. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, um, I think that's a great question. I think, but it's going to be looked at through the risk lens, and it's going to be looked at through the legal lens in a lot of ways, because there's a fine line between a group of people helping a neighbor versus being a vigilante group. Like
Yeah.
there's that fine line, or what could be perceived, right? And I go back to, we're coming up on September, which is National Preparedness Month, right? And what do we always see? We see, and we see, hey, build a kit, and all this stuff, but right, build a kit, have a plan, all of those things. I think we need to back up a step though. Before you tell people to build a kit and build a plan, I think it's really being aware of the threats, risks, and hazards in your community. What are they? Because you can't build a plan. You can't. Yeah, you can have a general kit, but threats and risks are different. Like wildfires and earthquakes are the risk out here. Um, and I think, and going back to what Scott was saying, we've now more become collaboratively digitally rather than in person, and the pandemic really forced our hand, um, with a very specific term that we used. And I think that also had a psychological effect. Can't prove it. And I think I've shared this before, is that term social distancing, because they wanted us to socially distance. I think a better term, just in Dave's view, is physical distancing. Because when you say social distancing, that means I'm detached. I'm becoming more detached from the social fabric of our community, etc. Because I'm in my house, I'm with my family, or if I live alone, again, if I'm gam and I'm by myself, I'm not really connecting with other people as I used to. And I think physical distancing means I just need to just be away from you just so I'm not catching or transmitting things, versus losing that social, that tethering to our social our social belonging, right? And that's just my personal opinion. And I think that also has contributed, just Dave's opinion again. I think that's also contributed to some of the road rage things we saw last week. Like we become so detached from other people that we're just acting out. Everybody's just acting out now because what you do in your own house, everybody I think lost some level of social skills on how to deal with other people.
Yeah.
Um, even though, and then when we see on a regular basis all of these situations, road rage, people getting thrown into traffic, people getting attacked, you get overwhelmed with that information overload. And I think being aware of threats, risks, and hazards, understanding, the things that can impact you, training is important in terms of I need to train myself, whether it's things like knowing CPR. What I've found super interesting is not a lot of people know how to use a fire extinguisher, right? Like, and this is something it's more
Okay.
likely that you may have a small grease fire in your kitchen than somebody breaking into your house, but somebody doesn't know how to use that. And it's like,
Dave, I ran into a guy who's got a fire extinguisher in his kitchen and told me I don't know how to use it. Like, well, what's the point of having one?
but my point is that a risk or a
Yeah.
hazard
Yeah.
of something flammable could occur? Yes.
Yeah.
Should you know how to use that? Absolutely. These are little things of things that people just, go about their day to day. Oh, and I think part of it also has to do with mindset. Oh, well, that ain't going to happen here. There's we see that a lot out there.
Yeah.
Scott, Scott and I and Joel, we've talked to different folks out there and businesses and otherwise who, when you share with them, hey, maybe you need to do a risk assessment of your organization, and they're like, oh, we're good, until fast forward 6 months, they're calling you to say, hey, the bad thing you said that was going to happen happened,
Right.
even though you told me it was going to happen and I didn't believe you. Now we need to engage and do whatever you suggested because we need to fix this problem. And an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I really think understanding, knowing those threats, risks, and hazards, and then building out your plans and your kits and all that other stuff matter in a lot
There's
of ways.
you know, when I used to manage security departments and with the security company we owned, we had an example. We had a bank, and the bank called us and said we've had three of our places robbed, and so we want to have security. So you go, okay, so you get the contract done, you provide the security in the bank. 6 months goes by and there's no robberies, and some bean counter somewhere goes, why are we spending all this money on security? And some manager will say, well, because three of our places were robbed. And the bean counter will ask, well, has one been robbed since then? No. Well, then we don't need the security. And they don't do the math and realize the reason why they haven't been robbed is because they have the security, so they let it go. And so since we're talking about mindset changes, and then this will probably be, last question because we're running long here, but that's okay. Does there not need to also be a mindset change among organizations and companies where security is concerned, from the standpoint that it cannot just be a cost center, a necessary cost center anymore? We'll do it because we have to, as opposed to there's a benefit there. For example, you mentioned Rodeo Drive and the high-end stores. If I live in an area like that, and I've seen on social media, the news, that these stores are getting robbed all the time or people are coming in, I don't want to go into the store if it's going to be like that. But I feel more comfortable going into the store when I see that they have mitigated that by having an active security presence. So at some point, the security presence becomes a positive from the customer's point of view, not just a line item that we had to do to mitigate loss. Am I on track with that? I mean, what are you guys' thoughts? Last thoughts. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, well, we've seen this, right? In Oakland, many retail establishments are leaving, hotels are leaving because they just don't get the support that they need. So I think we're going to continue to see people vote with their wallets. I mean, we've always seen this, we know this, we've acknowledged it, and people don't want to be in places that they find are unsafe. People don't want to raise their children in places that they find are unsafe. And how many times do you have to be robbed before you go, you know what, the weather's great here, but it's not worth my life. So I think we're getting to that kind of crescendo breaking point in many West Coast and several East Coast cities where they're just tired of it. And so people are leaving, and they're coming to places, in the central United States, like Texas and Arizona and other places, Idaho, a bunch of people moving out of the Pacific Northwest to Idaho. So, I'm not going to say blue or red, because that almost doesn't matter anymore. People don't care what your politics are when they're getting robbed at gunpoint by somebody who the system will let out. And we've talked about law enforcement zero, but correction zero is enjoined with that. In the very near future, there are not enough corrections officers, so we don't have enough people to even incarcerate the bad guys that are doing the bad things. So when we're in this world, we're in this like vicious cycle of, like I can't feel safe. I was talking to a young lady from New York yesterday, and she was like, "Yeah, I want to go shoot guns and I want to own guns and things like that." And I was like, "Well, you live in the wrong state or the wrong city, right?" She not able to own guns in New York City without lots of licensing and things like that. That makes it prohibitive, right? Why would you pay thousands of dollars to do something that costs hundreds, if that? So it's really unfortunate that we're going to continue to see this degradation of mainly happening in cities, right? Where they're tired of stepping over, human waste and needles in playgrounds and things like that because of the government's lack of interest in really trying to make a decent impact on this. In fact, they're going the opposite direction with, oh, we'll just continue to raise rates and raise taxes, or restrict people's ability to insure themselves. So, Dave mentioned wildfires. The Insurance Institute of America just put out a study about insurance in all 50 United States for vehicles. It's going up by 50% in California, right? How can somebody afford to pay now 50% more in one of the highest automobile rate locations in the insurance locations in the country? How can people afford to pay more? Something's got to break. And I don't know what that is necessarily. I mean, we've seen some indications in history. None of them are good, but I hope whatever happens, government realizes that it can't do it alone, and that if they're going to lose their tax base, like states like California are, they're losing a tremendous tax base. And I'm not talking about the people, I'm talking about the businesses. Businesses pay historically more taxes than humans do, than individuals. So you've already lost Elon Musk and his two companies, SpaceX, or you are SpaceX and Tesla. That usually follows with other big companies. Boeing left in the late 90s.
Well,
You
I
know,
mentioned I mentioned Toyota Motor Sales USA, where I used to work. They left and
thank
left
you.
Torrance a
Yep.
long time ago, years ago.
Went
They
to
packed up and
Texas.
left the state.
Yeah.
Buck Knives, which used to be in El Cajon, California, packed up and left the state.
Right.
Hollywood, for all intents and purposes, no longer makes movies or TV shows in California very much. They make them all over the place, but they don't make them here. And so Hollywood, a lot of Hollywood has moved to Las Vegas and has moved to other places. So you're right. I mean, the industries they're going and they're out of here. And you're right. I mean, not only, well, and they pay tremendous taxes, but their employees do too. And guess where they leave? Where do the employees go? Well, the job just moved to Las Vegas, honey. I guess we're moving to Vegas, right? So off you
And
go.
COVID proved we can do that. We can manage businesses from people in remote locations. And why somebody who's working remote would stay in California and pay those taxes is beyond me, right? If you could live for your job anywhere in the United States, go to Tennessee, go to Texas. Well, don't go to Texas, but Tennessee is a good low tax
Somebody
state.
said to me the other day, "Why don't you move to Arizona?" I said, "I did."
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but you still live in California. That's true.
But by the way, Arizona's full. We're full. We've got all the
Arizona's full. So when you go to the
Sorry.
border, you'll see a sign that says, "Sorry, no
Keep
vacancy."
driving.
Just
Yep.
you can go through.
Yeah, there's room for one more, right? There's room. There's room. I'm gonna
I'm
throw that
looking
out
forward
there.
to that because the three of
don't-
us could get together and actually do this in person, which isn't a bad idea. You know what? We need to plan this, and then I want to hear Dave's last thoughts. Dave, why don't you and I plan a trip? We can jump in a car and go out to Phoenix, and we can do this in person. God knows I'm not thrilled. I don't particularly like the Phoenix Metro, but I do like Scott. So we can go out there. We can have, lunch, dinner, whatever. We can do one of these in person. That would be pretty darn cool. So, and it's not that far, honestly. So there you go. All right, last thoughts, Dave. What are you thinking?
Well, I think I think that non-security leaders of some of these, larger businesses and multinational corporations should certainly avoid security theater, in a lot of different ways. But also kind of discuss things at even higher levels, those companies that have like boards of directors as an example. One of the main things they have started to more recently discuss, and I'd say it's probably over the last 5 years or so, is all the cyber threats, right? That's the big thing, which is certainly a threat. But what you rarely hear at the board of director level is physical threats. You don't really hear too much of that in terms of what's impacting their different business units and things like that. And I think you know obviously you have a lot of CEOs out there like Elon and all those kind of folks that are very risk averse, right? They're just like, hey, running around doing their thing. If they weren't, they wouldn't be doing the things they normally do for business. So it's hard to get folks like that who are used to taking risk, to adjust their worldview to understand the security piece, I think. And I think it's really about educating those folks on the actual complexities of trying to keep people safe. And not to poke at our Secret Service, but you look at the complexities of how do we protect people, right? And that's one job of the Secret Service, is to protect people. And you can see that the lot of different things that they have to go through and how they've been absolutely dragged more recently, for some of their huge failures, right? So the reality is that I think business leaders need to start looking at security as more of a business partner rather than a cost center, and figuring out, hey, we all have a role to play in the organization, and Scott, you brought up the whole car insurance thing. Well, really, corporate security is car insurance, for lack of a better term. It is, because we have car insurance, but how often do you use it, right? You're paying for something you're hoping never to use, right? Corporate security is the exact same thing, in terms of keeping people safe. And that's how businesses need to look at that. They need to look at, that's an insurance policy to make sure that, and Joel, you brought up a good point. The bean counters are like, well, we haven't been robbed, so we don't need this anymore. Well, you need to have somebody kind of educate them. Well, yeah, the robberies and burglaries dipped as soon as we hired these folks, right? There's an intersection there that
I
needs
think
to be
your
looked
point
at.
is very valid too. They need to look at it from the standpoint that the building hasn't burned down, so we don't need fire insurance anymore. It's just as asinine a statement. And so I think that when you're connecting it with the idea of we need to have insurance because something could happen down the road. We haven't had a major fire, so we can go ahead and block all the emergency exits because nobody's going to need to run out of here. It never happens around here. These are idiotic, imbecilic ways of thinking in this world right now where we are. And so for bean counters to get in there and for corporate leaders to listen to the bean counter, you listen to the bean counter It's like I own real estate. I'm still here because I own rental real estate. And having been owned a company where I was a real estate broker for a while and I dealt with mostly investors. Now, I had an investor once tell me that you want to have an attorney involved in the deals that you're in, particularly if you're dealing with commercial property, and you want to have a broker, but you want to have a broker and an attorney and an accountant so that they can tell you what the risks are. But they don't get to make the decision on what risks you take and what risks you don't. They're there just to inform you of what the risks are. If an investor were to make only the deals the accountant and the attorney would say would be okay, they'll never make one. They'll never buy a property. They'll never sell a property, never make a dime. They'll go out of business. I can tell you from personal experience that's the case. Every property I bought was a risk. It worked out well. One property we sold. Okay, well, sometimes risks don't work out very well. The same thing here. If a bean counter is the one that decides whether your facility is safe or not, you're listening to the wrong person. The bean counter knows exactly nothing about keeping your facility and your people safe. Okay, I can't say it more strictly than that. There you are. Gentlemen, you're awesome. Thank you so much for getting on here with the old guy and talking about stuff. I'm going to talk to my son and see if I can get you each a kill bad dude's hat. I don't know where they came from, but if I can, I'll get you one. Hey, thank you again for watching the entire interview. I really do appreciate it. We're going to do these probably once a month with these guys, and we've got some other guests that are going to come on the show as well. And I'm also reaching out to some managers and owners of security companies. We'll see if we can get them on to give us an idea of what's happening with trends in the security business. So, if you haven't already subscribed, I urge you to do that. You can do so, as I said, on either Rumble or YouTube. I suggest Rumble, but YouTube's good too. And if you would like to follow me on X, that's at GunGuyTV, because I post these videos as well as my GunGuyTV videos, and pretty much everything I publish on my X account, which is my GunGuyTV X account. So you can do that as well. Thank you again. Have a wonderful week, and take a class with us at Practical Defense Systems.